Rest should feel like relief, but for some people, rest feels like accusation. You sit down, and something inside you tightens. You cancel your plans, and a thin unease starts to crawl under your skin. You try to take a quiet day, and your mind begins listing everything you're failing to do. Even when nothing is urgently wrong, you feel wrong for stopping. And the strange part is that the guilt doesn't feel like a thought you choose. It feels like a voice. It has tone. It has personality. It has rules. It says, you're wasting time. It says, you're falling behind. It says, other people are doing more than you. It says, you don't deserve this. And if you listen closely, you'll notice something unsettling. The voice often doesn't sound like you. It sounds trained. Because guilt around rest is rarely a natural instinct. It's a conditioning. It's an internalized supervisor, a moralized pressure that turns stillness into sin. So, the question is not just, why do I feel guilty when I rest? The deeper question is, who benefits from you never stopping? And even deeper, who taught you that your worth requires constant proof? In psychological terms, the guilt you feel during rest is often a form of internalized control. It may come from family systems, school systems, religious systems, economic systems, any environment where approval was attached to productivity, performance, or emotional convenience. You learned that being valuable meant being useful. And what begins as external pressure eventually becomes internal law. The law says, if you slow down, you are unsafe. That sounds dramatic, but the body often agrees. Because for many people, rest is not simply the absence of activity, rest is the absence of distraction. And when distraction drops away, what rises is the material you've been outrunning. Grief, fear, anger, emptiness, longing, self-doubt. So the psyche invents a moral argument to keep you moving. It calls the argument responsibility. It calls it discipline. It calls it ambition. But beneath it is often a simpler truth. Stopping would force you to feel what you've been avoiding. This is why some people can be physically exhausted and still feel unable to rest. The nervous system is not just tired, it's vigilant. And vigilance does not interpret stillness as safety. It interprets stillness as exposure. To understand the guilt, it helps to treat that inner voice as a psychological figure, not a fact. In Jungian language, it can resemble a complex, an internal subpersonality charged with emotion and history, formed around repeated experiences. This figure might be a harsh inner parent, a moral judge, an internal foreman. It might not be your true self speaking. It might be an inherited voice that took up residence in your mind because it once helped you adapt. If you grew up with praise that only arrived when you achieved, that voice learned its job. If you grew up with criticism when you relaxed, it learned its weapon. If you grew up in a home where adults were stressed and you had to be good, the voice became a disciplinarian to prevent rejection. Sometimes the training is explicit. Don't be lazy. Hard work builds character. You haven't earned a break. Only weak people rest. Sometimes it's subtle. Affection when you perform, distance when you don't. Warmth when you're productive, irritation when you're not. Children are not abstract thinkers. They don't analyze these patterns and decide what to believe. They absorb them as reality. So the child concludes, my rest costs me love. And later, the adult feels guilty resting, even in a life where nobody is demanding anything in the present. The past demand has been installed. This is why guilt can persist even when your external circumstances change. You might live alone, you might have autonomy, you might even have permission. But guilt isn't asking for permission. Guilt is enforcing an old contract. The contract says, if you stop, you become unworthy. Now add another layer. In many cultures, productivity isn't just encouraged, it's moralized. You're not simply doing things, you're proving something. Competence, discipline, virtue, deservedness. This moralization creates a dangerous confusion that your existence must be justified by output. If your worth depends on output, then rest feels like worthlessness. So you keep producing, you keep moving, you keep staying busy. And if you've ever wondered why you can't enjoy your own free time, it may be because free time triggers an identity crisis. Without tasks, you're forced to confront a question you don't usually have to face. Who am I when I'm not doing? For many people, that question is frightening because doing has become a defense against being. Being means feeling. Being means perceiving your own needs. Being means noticing the quiet truths you've been suppressing. So the inner voice yells, and you obey it because disobeying feels like danger. A common mistake is to treat this as a simple mindset problem. I should think more positively about rest. But the guilt is often not cognitive, it's relational. It's the echo of a relationship where rest was punished or shamed. So the healing is also relational. You have to change your relationship with that internal voice. First, you have to identify it. When guilt appears, ask, whose tone is this? Who does it resemble? What age did I learn this rule? What happens if I break it? You may notice the voice uses absolutes. Always, never, should, must. It speaks in moral categories: good, bad, worthy, unworthy. That's not the language of the self. That's the language of conditioning. The self, in Jungian terms, tends to speak through symbols, intuitions, quiet knowing. It doesn't berate you, it orients you. The berating voice often belongs to the superego or an internalized authority figure. It believes it is protecting you through pressure. It thinks fear is discipline, and fear can produce results. That's why it's so hard to let it go. You may have built your entire life on that pressure. If you release it, you might worry you'll become nothing. You'll become lazy, you'll lose momentum, you'll waste your potential, you'll disappoint everyone, you'll fall behind. But notice the structure of that fear. It assumes your natural state is collapse. That assumption is itself a trauma belief. Healthy systems don't require constant self-threat to function. Healthy motivation doesn't need cruelty. If your only way to move is by whipping yourself, the problem isn't your work ethic. The problem is the inner relationship. Another thing guilt does is hide anger. Sometimes the voice that shames you for resting is covering a deeper rage. Rage that you had to earn what should have been freely given. Rage that you weren't allowed to be a child. Rage that you were praised for being easy to manage. Rage that your humanity was inconvenient. But anger is dangerous in some homes, so it converts into guilt. Guilt is safer than anger because guilt points inward. It makes you blame yourself, not the system that trained you. So your psyche stays compliant. This is why the video's subtitle matters. And who trained that voice? Because once you locate the trainer, you stop treating the guilt as truth. You start treating it as an artifact. And artifacts can be studied, they can be understood, they can be retired. Now consider another layer. If you tend toward caretaking, rest can feel guilty because you associate rest with selfishness. Caretakers often learn to scan others first, to prioritize the room, not the self. To be good by being attentive to everyone else's needs. So when you rest, a part of you feels like you're abandoning something, a responsibility, a person, a role. Even if no one is asking, even if the person you feel responsible for is an internal ghost, a parent's stress, a family's stability, a teacher's expectations, you may be resting in the present, but your nervous system is still serving the past. In Jungian terms, this can be seen as a possession by a complex. You are temporarily taken over by an old psychic configuration. You become the child trying to stay safe through performance. The work is to bring consciousness into that moment. Instead of immediately obeying the guilt, you make contact with it. You might say internally, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep me acceptable. You're trying to keep me safe. That may sound strange, but it changes the relationship from domination to dialogue. And dialogue is how integration begins. Rest guilt also thrives on vague standards. Notice how the voice rarely specifies a reasonable requirement. It doesn't say, do one important thing today then relax. It says, do more. It says, not enough. This not enough is an endless horizon. It's a psychological treadmill that keeps you outrunning the feeling of insufficiency. But insufficiency is not solved by more work. It's often solved by confronting the belief beneath it. I am only lovable when I'm producing. That belief is old. And if it's old, you don't argue with it once and win. You untrain it through repetition and experience. The experience you need is simple, but not easy. Resting and surviving. Resting and not being punished. Resting and still being loved by others, yes, but also by yourself. Because self-respect is not just how you treat yourself when you're strong, it's how you treat yourself when you're tired. This is where the shadow appears again. If you have a strong, productive persona, the shadow may contain what you call laziness, but what you label lazy may actually be the disowned part of you that wants to live at a human pace. The part that wants to feel, the part that doesn't want to spend life proving its right to exist. If that part has been rejected for years, it may show up in distorted forms: procrastination, burnout, binging, numbscrolling, sleep avoidance, sudden collapses. The psyche will take its rest one way or another. If you don't choose rest consciously, your body will choose it for you through breakdown. So learning to rest without guilt is not indulgence, it's prevention, it's integration, it's making peace with your own humanity. But to do it, you'll need to practice a different kind of discipline, the discipline of not obeying the inner tyrant. Start small, not with a week off, not with a dramatic declaration. Start with 10 minutes where you do nothing productive and you stay present with the discomfort. You will feel the voice, it will protest, it will call the experiment irresponsible. Let it speak, and then let it pass without action. This is how you teach the nervous system a new association. Stillness does not equal danger. Over time, you may notice something surprising. Guilt is often the gatekeeper to sadness. When you rest, and you don't immediately fill the time, a tenderness may rise, a fatigue that isn't just physical, a grief for how hard you've been on yourself, a grief for how little permission you were given. That grief is not weakness, it's a return of feeling. And feeling is the beginning of life. Another practice is to make rest specific. Guilt thrives in ambiguous space, but if you define rest as intentional care sleep, a walk, a meal, silence, reading, you remove the sense that you're wasting time. You're not wasting, you're recovering, you're regulating, you're restoring the part of you that work cannot replace. Also, notice whether your rest is truly rest. Some people rest while internally working, planning, worrying, strategizing, rehearsing conversations. They lie down, but their mind remains at the factory. So the body never receives the message. Real rest includes permission, and permission is what the trained voice tries to steal. At some point, you may realize that the voice doesn't only police rest, it polices joy. Because joy is also unproductive. Joy is also unearned by the rules of the inner judge. This is why guilt can appear when things are going well, when you feel calm, when you have a good day. The inner system mistrusts ease because ease wasn't safe in the past. Ease invited unpredictability. Ease invited the moment something went wrong. So the voice keeps you tense. It tells you not to relax, because relaxation feels like inviting pain. If that resonates, then the work is not merely learning to rest, it's learning to tolerate safety. That sounds paradoxical, but it's real. Many people have to build a capacity for peace the way others build a capacity for stress. Peace can feel unfamiliar. Unfamiliar can feel dangerous, so you return to what you know. Pressure. This is why people who feel guilty resting often keep recreating urgency. They take on too much. They say yes too quickly. They fill every gap. They avoid the quiet. The quiet is where the psyche waits, not to punish you, but to tell you the truth. So what is the truth beneath your guilt? Maybe it's, I'm exhausted and I've been pretending I'm not. Maybe it's, I don't know who I am without performance. Maybe it's, I was trained to be useful, not to be cared for. Maybe it's, I learned to survive by earning my place. The trained voice doesn't want you to ask these questions. It wants you to stay busy. Because if you stop and listen, you might change your life. You might realize your schedule is not only full, it's protective. You might realize your ambition has been partly driven by fear. You might realize you're loyal to an internal authority that doesn't deserve your loyalty. And then you might do something radical. You might treat yourself like a person, not a machine. Jung wrote about individuation as the process of becoming who you are rather than who you were trained to be. Guilt around rest is often the friction between those two selves, the trained self and the emerging self. The trained self says, work to be worthy. The emerging self says, you are already worthy, now live. That emerging self may feel quiet at first. It may not have strong arguments. It may not sound persuasive. It may sound like a whisper, please stop, please let me breathe. And you might ignore it for years because the loud voice has always won. But if you practice listening to the whisper, it grows. Not into laziness, into discernment, into a life where effort has meaning and rest has dignity, into a psyche that doesn't need to be threatened into motion. And when you finally rest without guilt, you may notice something else. You become more honest. Because constant doing is often a way of avoiding being honest about what hurts, rest brings you back into contact with your inner life. And your inner life is not an obstacle to success. It's the place where you become real. If you feel guilty when you rest, don't just ask what's wrong with you. Ask whose voice that is. Ask what it's trying to protect. Ask what it costs you. Because the goal isn't to silence the voice with positivity. The goal is to outgrow the need for it. To become the kind of person who can stop without fear. To become the kind of person who doesn't treat rest as failure, but as a return to yourself. And that return is not a luxury. It's psychological survival.